Welcome, everybody, to Conversations About Race. It's About Time, episode 2. And we are your hosts, Siri and
Danielle.
And you might realize that we are two very white women. And that's somewhat intentional, is that we've done a lot of learning, and we're still learning. We are learning a foreign language in many ways, as you said last week. And we are here to share with you our learnings, hoping that it will encourage you to do the same.
Yes, there's a lot to be learned, and there's actually a lot of information out there. It's just that I think a lot of times, I know a lot of times, we just aren't taught about anything other than white history.
Yeah, so our theme for today is, how did we get here? What is the history that got us to where we are today? Meaning specifically the protests that are happening not just in all 50 states of the United States, but all around the world. There are people who are protesting almost entirely peacefully, protesting.
Yeah, I think 18 countries.
Yeah. And so we just want to talk about here, but as we're talking, before we jump into it, I just want a real reminder that this is new for a lot of us. Most of us have never had to really, you kind of have to go out of your way to learn about Black history and to learn the perspective of Black people. Because in our culture, our entire structure and system and everything is built around white people. And so that's so normal to us. And so we'd have to literally go out of our way to learn anything else. And most of the time we don't.
No, not at all. And I think what we'll talk about some today is how our society and institutions have kind of been designed to keep us separated.
Yeah. And so also in that process of us not knowing, as we start to learn, there can be feelings of defensiveness and guilt and shame and anger. And all of those are totally normal. I think we've been through all the 50 shades of realizing that you have a lot to learn and all of those feelings. So just because you feel uncomfortable doesn't mean that this is not an important journey for you to go on. In fact, we're doing it together.
Yeah, and I can also say it's pretty normal to be uncomfortable. I've been talking to a lot of my friends, and, I think we've been talking a lot about police, and it's hard for sometimes white people to understand what the Black experience is with the police. And I've validated a lot of those feelings because as a white person, if I encounter a police officer, usually I'm treated respectfully, I'm greeted, I'm calmly asked for my license and registration. And sometimes I can even defend myself of saying oh, no, I didn't mean to speed, or I didn't know my taillight was out. And, and I'll have a very comfortable interaction. So, if that's always my experience when I encounter police, it's going to be hard for me to see a different reality. And I think, in a broader sense, as white people, because our experiences are so much different than people of color, and we're talking about the Black community, it's hard for us to understand how our experiences could be that much different. And so, therefore, these things become eye-opening.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about a professor that you might have loved in college or even in high school, and you started to hear from one of your friends that teacher was really mean in another class, you might initially not believe it and discredit it because that's not your experience. But if 2 or 3 or 4 of your friends start to say quietly, actually, he said some things that were very hurtful and inappropriate, after a while you might realize they have a point. And I think that's something that, as we have investigated and gone outside of our little white bubbles to listen to the experiences of Black people, we are realizing there is another story that is really kind of coming out, and we're not all dealing with it well. There's all sorts of feelings going on.
Yeah, and nor are we experts. But I think educating ourselves about the Black experience allows us to see the Black experience. Going back to the police, now that I know how much different the experiences with police, interactions with police are for the Black community, now if I'm driving along and I see somebody pulled over, I'm looking in the car, I'm looking to check and see if they're okay. I'm looking to see what race they are, because I know that not everybody's experience is like mine. And that allows me then, when I do hear about horrible things, which I don't want to hear about, that I can understand and like fit those into my worldview, that those do happen.
Yeah, you don't automatically dismiss it as being silly. You realize this happens.
It
This
does.
happens. Yeah. So we wanted to get into the history, and I saw something really funny today that sort of exemplified my perspective. And it's very short. It said, American history books are like, slavery was bad, but then Lincoln fixed it. Then segregation was also bad, but Malcolm X didn't need to be so mean about it. But Martin Luther King went on a big walk and fixed racism. The last racist that was left killed him, but then he went to jail. The end. And as I read that, I started laughing to myself, because if you would have asked me, talk about the history of Black people in America, it probably wouldn't have been much longer than that.
Most of us don't know much more than that, because that's all we're taught in schools. And I think, it's a very human impulse, right, to want to gloss over and not spend a lot of time on the things that aren't so pleasant or things we're ashamed of. And I think we've done that as a country, and and it's horrible, because we're missing out on this entire narrative of Black people that a lot of us who are white would even know their names.
Right. And you had something similar. A friend of yours posted something, and she had a very similar little blurb. Do you want to read that for us?
Yeah, so this is from my friend Camila. And she wrote, I have always known about white America. The history I learned in school was mostly white American history. The majority of my history I learned from my parents, other family members, the greater community, and self-study. If I relied on the textbooks, I would have grown up thinking that only about a handful of Black folks had ever done anything of historical significance, and that after Harriet Tubman freed every slave all on her own, and then white folks were still mean. Years later, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came and made just one speech and had a dream. In a march after Rosa Parks rode the bus just one time and sat in the front. That's what I would have known about Black history.
Yeah. So we're certainly not experts, but we're going to try to fill in a couple more gaps than that. So this is maybe the Cliff's Notes versions. But I also just to talk about that perspective of the history of how we got to where we are today. So obviously we all know that slaves were brought by force. They were denied their language, they were denied their religion, they were denied their culture. They were deeply, deeply abused. There's been an attempt, this is not how I grew up, thank goodness, but I've heard other adults my age who were taught a very whitewashed version of slavery, which was sort of that, slaves were mostly happy, and yes, some bad things happened, but, the slave owners would sometimes treat their slaves as family, and that's really not fair. That's really
not fair at all. And actually, a lot of families were separated. And this caused slave families to lose their culture. It's I think as white Americans, we'll talk a lot about like, where you're from, and we can say, I'm Swedish and German, and all of this. And now we have like ancestry DNA that helps a little bit, but most African Americans have been robbed of that experience, and a lot of that stems back to the separation of families that even parents. Black parents would say like, oh no, my boy isn't a hard worker, he can't do this. They would try to talk down their children's abilities so that their families wouldn't be separated.
Wow. So it was deeply, deeply traumatic, and this lasted for several hundred years. We had the whole Civil War, in which people were fighting to keep humans as property, and that was a huge part of it. And then with the Emancipation Proclamation, it was said they were no longer property, but then this began this whole other time period in which Black people existed as separate, and so this was like all the Jim Crow laws.
Well, views didn't change, even though they were free. People still viewed them essentially as property or as other, and I've heard or read that like Lincoln actually wanted to make reparations and give these freed slaves land, but then he was assassinated. And so then suddenly like freed slaves nobody wanted to sell them property because just freeing them didn't change people's deeply held beliefs that
Right.
that they were property or that they were other, they were somehow less worthy, or they wanted to keep their distance from these people.
Yeah. So you have no property. You have no way to get an education to get ahead. Meanwhile, whites are still benefiting from slavery. And you have many, many decades that have passed in which it's incredibly dangerous to be a black person. If you will, in 1955, a white woman accused a 14-year-old boy of flirting with her. And this was Emmett Till's, and a bunch of white guys beat him up and murdered him. And there was nobody cared. Nobody cared because the life of a black person wasn't worth anything. And later, she said that she lied, and nothing happened. And black people knew this wasn't just one event. This is what happened. You could get killed, lynched, beaten up, harassed, raped at any point, and no one cared. You had no follow-through, no consequence for the person who would do this. Hence, civil rights.
Because there was no justice.
Right.
As we've been hearing, like no justice, no peace.
Justice, no peace.
And it's true. And even when our Constitution was written, that all men are created equal. Like at that time, like black people were still considered property. So even in our Constitution, they weren't considered full people.
Yeah, right. Hence all the amendments. So then we had civil rights, which was a very, very long process. It was not one person. It was not one movement.
Not just Martin Luther King Jr.
No. Last night I watched a movie called The Freedom Riders, which if you watch the Lenten series that we had this last spring, Pastor Carolyn Filstrom said that really inspired her. So, of course, I had to watch that movie. I didn't know this. So, brief recap. I don't know if you've seen this or heard about this.
I've heard about it. I'm not sure if I've actually seen it.
Okay. So,
I did watch it, yeah.
There was this was 1961, a young group of idealistic black and white men and women who called themselves CORE, who wanted to change the world by taking a 2-week bus trip down to the South. And what they would do is every time they just take Greyhound, right? Just take Greyhound. And every time they stopped to eat somewhere, they would go into places where everything was segregated. They'd go into white spaces and they would ask for a cup of coffee. They'd ask for food. And the black and white group people would be together and they would take whatever came. And they had some real, a couple trainings where they acted out someone being very, very rude and sort of pushing them over. But they didn't really know. So they go on this, and for the first couple days, it was mostly okay. But the deeper south they went, people started to hear about this. In Alabama, this is where everything kind of went crazy. The governor called them agitators, and I saw, pieces of his speech where he said, these people are not following our laws. The laws are for our own good. They're good for whites. They're good for blacks. These people are challenging our laws. They're breaking the laws. They're agitators. And when they pulled up to this town, basically a mob of angry men and people in KKK things were waiting for them, threw a bomb in the bus, and beat somebody so badly. And it was just a horrific scene, and it made the news. And then there was a second bus. Okay, I'm making this really long. But the point was, they were not prepared. They were completely horrified by the violence and the hatred. And then no one would drive them. No Greyhound bus driver would take them back. So they basically left with their tail between their legs. And then all of a sudden, lo and behold, there was another bus coming, and they didn't know who. And this is what's so cool. There was a whole group of college kids from Fisk University that were trained and experienced protesting nonviolently. They had been beaten, they had been jailed, they all had records. They were veterans. And they saw these poor young people trying to do something sweet and get kind of scared to death. They got on a bus and they decided they were going to keep it going. And then they had very violent encounters. I mean, they were completely peaceful. But the point of these peaceful protests was to unmask the hatred and to unmask the violence. And I'll just say one more thing about it. As these people were protested and President Kennedy was watching this and kind of wishing these people would stop, it became more and more apparent that they were going to need protection. And there was one amazing scene in which he kind of is forced to send down the National Guard, and they're bringing them from one city to the next, and they cross the state lines into Mississippi, and they were promised that they would have someone waiting for them, and there was no one waiting for them. And they basically went into a trap, and they were attacked. The hatred. And not only was this a bother to people of all levels of government, there was just like, this is stupid, these people should stop, to the vitriolic hatred of wanting to murder and bomb and hurt these people. It was so sad and gross to see. And that was 50 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. How would that have all dissipated in this time?
Mm-hmm. Especially if we don't want to talk about it, if we don't want to tell those stories, right? It's not till somebody like makes a movie that all of a sudden we're like, oh, that story existed. Because those are the stories that maybe nobody wants to tell because it's easier. You know, I've heard like talk about whitewashing history. It's easier to whitewash a history and say like, it's all good, it's all fine now, it's all rainbows.
Right. I mean, the governor, the mayor of one town, literally told the police force, he talked to the KKK and said, I'll give you 15 minutes before I show up to protect this bus coming in. You can do whatever you want. Do you think that so easily just disappeared from America in the last couple generations?
Don't think so.
I don't think so. So even though some good rights were passed, I'm doing a lot of talking, sorry. You can
That's okay.
push me over at any point. But there's other things going on, like in World War II, the GI Bill. You know about this with housing and stuff. Do you want to talk about the unfairness of the white GI Bill versus
the black GI Bill?
Yeah.
You start out about it, but I want to add something that you start talking about it.
Okay. So this is just another example of how white and black peoples are not starting life off on the same foot at all. So World War II, which feels like a long time ago, when veterans came back from that war, there was the GI Bill, and one of the things was that there were all these suburbs that were going up all over the country, and you get your little plot and you get a mortgage. Everybody except the black people were not allowed a mortgage. They couldn't get a house. And so they had to live in these little apartments that kind of became kind of forgotten. They kind of got forgotten about. And realtors would actively go out and tell white people that if a black person moved into their neighborhood, they'd lose property value. They went door to door on a campaign to tell them this, to basically keep people in their place. And so this was, and this carried on for generations. And so you have white people who bought mortgages that they passed down, who were able to just build a life. And all of those were denied people who were black. Mortgages, banking, jobs, just roadblocks all the time from people who didn't want them.
Mm-hmm. And I would say like also in war, black soldiers were often sent to the front lines and died in combat more than white soldiers. And then there was higher levels of PTSD. And then some of those, I just watched the movie Just Mercy, which is also free right now to stream for the month of June. But one of the people portrayed in that, who was a real person, committed a violent crime, but he had very severe PTSD. And even when he was defended in court, like they didn't even mention his military service and his PTSD. So, and that I think was a pretty common narrative. So not only were they denied these mortgages and things like that, a lot more of them died, and the ones who survived often had had severe PTSD from being exposed to worse conditions, being seen as more dispensable, which again is back to that history of slavery.
Yeah. And then on top of it, we have school systems that are built off of property taxes. And so in Black communities where basically Black people haven't been able to own mortgages, or it's been a lot harder for them.
And the property values are less, which
Property
means
values
you
are
pay less on your property taxes.
Yeah. It's just, can you see that this is just compounding? And for us to say, hey, slavery was history, the civil rights movement happened, everything is in an even playing field is just absolutely ignorant and difficult to say. It's heartbreaking because you have generational privileges that compound and generational deficits that can compound, and it's so hard to create a balance there. Mm-hmm. Not to mention just the fact that all of these institutions consciously and unconsciously favor white people and don't favor Black people, mean that Black people are sort of walking around trying to fit anywhere they'll be allowed to fit.
And it's really hard. I was reading statistics, I think from 2014, that for a Black person or Black family to move into a mostly white neighborhood, that Black family would have to make $100,000 a year to live among white people that are making $30,000 a year. So that's the kind of disparities we're still seeing in housing.
Yeah.
And then they still may not be, regardless of how much they make, they still may not be accepted in that neighborhood. Because even though we don't go around, knocking on doors anymore saying, like, if you sell to this Black person, your property is going to be worth less, there still is, I know, especially in the Twin Cities, there's still a lot of housing discrimination.
Yeah, and that's really hard to put your finger on that. I was reading in one of my books, Waking Up White, which is a really good book. She referenced, and I couldn't find it because I couldn't remember the title, but it was just in the 90s, it was like an expose where they took two guys, a white guy and a Black guy, who both graduated from college, both straight A students. Did I talk about this last week?
I don't think so.
Okay, all right. Well, a little repetition might not be bad. But they both graduated straight A's from college, and they were sent with hidden cameras to a new city that none of them had ever been into to get a job in the same field and to get an apartment and to open up a bank account. And you can imagine what happened is every time the white guy walked into a room, hands were out, smiles. I mean, he just filled out a couple pieces of paperwork and off he went. And the Black guy with the exact same intelligence and qualifications had just people questioning him and, really looking at him, making everything difficult. He had to fill out 3 times the amount of paperwork to open up a bank account. They went to the same apartment building, and the Black person was told that apartment was gone. And then we watch as the white guy walks to the same place and gets an apartment. Mm-hmm. So how can we say that this is an even playing field? And then, of course, just talking about policing and the history of policing has been deeply, deeply racist roots back in the, I don't know if there's anything you want to jump in and say.
Well, I want to jump back to opportunity because something I often cite when I'm talking to people about white privilege is they've done studies of just sending out resumes. So they'll send out the exact same resume, and one will have a white-sounding name, and one will have a black-sounding name, and it's like 9 times out of 10, or maybe higher than that, that the white person is hired over the Black person with the exact same resume.
Yeah.
And that's also true for like colleges as well, where they have equally qualified candidates. Like white students get in 80%, or 80% of the white students will get in, and
And so efforts like affirmative action, where they try to have a quota of people you hire, a quota of people that you have in college being a person of color or something like that, was sort of an attempt to even the playing field, but if you really go deep into that, you'll realize that that is one tiny sliver of a massive, massive problem that needs to be addressed. So it's not like it's a bad thing, but it's certainly not your silver bullet that's suddenly magically, evened the playing field for everybody.
Right. It raises people's consciousness, but again, just like all these other things, like abolishing slavery, it didn't change people's views.
Yeah. And so finally, I think this is something I never would have thought about 2-3 weeks ago, but in all the research that I've done, there was this great article on the history of just the Minneapolis police. And if you know someone who's a police officer and love them, you're allowed to. You're allowed to care about people. This isn't us versus them. This isn't all or this or all or this. That's not about this. This is about listening to the reality, looking at statistics and listening to the reality of stories and asking for a change in the system. When we find out that something is very wrong in, say, the church, you change the way things are structured. You change things in order to correct that.
When there isn't accountability, which is,
Yeah.
I think, what we're seeing a lot of, or when a badge is seen as a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Yeah.
Then when there's too much power with no, checks and balances is like a value we have that's an American value. But if we look, very specifically at the Minneapolis Police Department, there was no checks and balances. And that created a very dangerous situation, especially for people of color and especially for our Black community.
Yeah. And so history, the very first beginning of the Minneapolis police was, to kind of police Black neighborhoods and to oppose unions. And a lot of people of color and minorities had very negative experiences. So that was sort of the early roots. And then attempts to sort of help and reform that haven't always worked. And just one example, I just read a story about a woman police officer who pulled over a Black man, and he was terrified. He was terrified because he thought he'd be shot. And she was trying to talk to him calmly and say, "No, I'm not going to shoot you. It's going to be okay." And then one of her colleagues, another officer, pulled up, and she was trying to tell that police officer, "It's okay. I've got it. Well, guess what happened? He comes out, he sees this person as a threat simply because the color of his skin, and this person ends up being shot, not by her. She goes and she tries to turn the police officer in. Guess which one of them is fired?
The person.
She is. So as I'm listening to these stories and reading, and people are sending me articles, this is all over the place. So there is a reason people are marching, and there's a reason people are so upset. And the fact that I didn't know this was because I lived in a safe little bubble. I didn't have to know about it, and I don't even have to care. This would never affect me. Whether changes happen or not is probably not going to affect me, and that's because I have privilege.
Yeah, and we should never be okay when, like, a good officer, right, like that woman, like, who is trying to keep accountability, when she's fired, when these things keep happening, like, that should be something we all care about, that we should all stand for. But yeah, so many times we don't even hear about it.
Yeah, and I think now more police officers are trying to stand up and say, yeah, we do need some really big systematic changes, that the way things are run is sort of like you're given a hammer and you see everything as a nail, right? You treat everything as a nail, and there's a different way to do things.
Yeah. Oh, and another statistic I read is that only 5% of the Minneapolis Police Department actually lives in that community.
Yeah, and so what difference does that make? Like, what does that mean?
Well, I think it's just like where we started. If we're coming full circle, when people don't know each other, when they have no idea what somebody's experience is like, or even what a community or neighborhood is like, when they're just coming in thinking they need to intervene and they're trained to intervene violently, like, imagine the horrors that are going to happen. So I think that was just like another eye-opening statistic to, like, understand, because I think, again, maybe it's hard for us as white people to understand how it got that bad, or really how it was bad and hasn't gotten better, which I think is probably a more accurate portrayal. But I think, at the core, there's some really big systematic things, and then there's just on the micro level where we just need to know. Like, we need to educate ourselves about what's happening, and then we need to, like, actually get out and put ourselves out there.
Yeah.
Because if we had been oppressed, if this was our history as white people, we probably wouldn't want to be, say the roles were reversed and, whites are the oppressed group, blacks are the group in power. Would we want to go out of our way to, like, be friendly or have conversations with them?
That's the interesting thing, is that why don't we know all of this? If what we just told you is true, why doesn't everybody know this? Why haven't people been yelling about this forever and reporting in the media? Like, why isn't this a thing? What do you think, Danielle?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that.
There are a lot of answers to why we don't know this.
But I think, if I'm an oppressed person and you look like the person that oppressed me, am I going to trust you with my story? And if I do trust you with my story and then you discredit me and you say it couldn't happen, or you say, well, you go deal with that, you go stand up for yourself, and that happens again and again and again and again, are you gonna tell your story? Am I gonna hear about that because I look like somebody who oppressed you? And then there's all our systems of power. If I want to maintain power, I want to look good. And honestly, a lot of these things don't make American society look very good.
I think that's the one thing that I didn't understand, is that Black people can't tell us the truth because we can't handle it. We don't like to hear it. We get very defensive. We get dismissive. And I can just feel that within myself. When I learned that maybe I did or said or had a belief thing that was hurtful or harmful, my first reaction is to be defensive. And I can only imagine what it must feel like to try to have my voice out there and to try to say stuff and to have so many people of power telling me that I'm wrong, telling me that I'm too sensitive, telling me that I'm angry, that I just need to do this or that, and
or
dismissing
telling me it's my fault.
Yes, blaming the victim.
Oh, you shouldn't have said that to the officer. You shouldn't have done this. You shouldn't have been wearing this. You shouldn't have been walking like this.
Right.
And, again, that is going to create a hostile environment for change to happen because we're not seeing the victim as the victim and we're defending then the oppressor, which I think, again, is important that we educate ourselves and learn.
Yeah. And you can see that. If you're paying attention to the news, you will see how quickly people want to defend the oppressor and blame the victim in the language. Once you're attuned to it, you really start to see it, and it's very creepy in the media, how things can get twisted in that way. And I think it's, in a lot of ways, it's very subconscious. We don't really know that we're doing it. It's the way we've been trained to see the world.
Yeah, it's implicit bias, which there's a great website, Project Implicit. It's a Harvard study where you can actually go on and they send you through a series of just different tests, and it will tell you more about your own implicit bias. So not the explicit bias, right? If we actually injure another person or are saying racial slurs, that's not explicit bias. But implicit bias is the ways under the surface that we don't even realize that we might be favoring a white person over a Black person. Another resource is I just learned that Hennepin County Libraries are offering White Fragility and 2 other books digitally for free.
Yes. So there's a lot of great books out there. There's a lot of good articles. There's good videos. We'll try to make you aware of them. But as we put this to a close, what I will say is this may feel very overwhelming. And so one of the things we want to do is, and we're learning, is that simply as a white person believing that racism is wrong but doing nothing about it, we're actually continuing to let the cogs of the machine still go and do their thing. we can read about stories and go, oh, that's too bad. I wish that wasn't the case. But the wheels are still turning. And so what I've recently realized is that it's so important for us to change and educate ourselves, and then to start speaking up and having conversations with other people and asking for changes in systems to have the wheels stop. Stop running over people, stop hurting people, so that we can have a change in which truly there can be equity and real justice for everybody.
Yeah, I think once we all start taking ownership for our part in racism, then we can start changing it. Then we can start making this world more equitable. Because I think when we get defensive, it's because we really do want a world where everybody's treated fairly and equally. And it's hard for us to see that it's not. But I think when we all start with ourselves, then, then we can then start looking larger, right? Start looking at policies and things like that, other ways that we can stand up. But I think it does start with being willing to acknowledge the ways that we didn't know, and to say, like, we can do better.
We didn't know. We can all do better. And yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for this second session, Danielle.
Yes, it's been lovely.
Yeah, next week we're going to talk about, okay, so that's all a thing. Now, how do we become an ally? What are the good things that we can do, and what are the mistakes and pitfalls that white people will often do trying to be allies to Black people? And we're going to wade through that together next week. So thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you.